Jon Soltz is a U.S. Army veteran. He served 2 combat tours in Iraq and then came home to co-found VoteVets.org. Last week, he penned a piece for the Huffington Post in which he labeled GOP frontrunner Donald Trump's recent foreign policy speech frighteningly erratic, and said the one clear message he took away from the speech is that Donald Trump doesn't care about foreign or military policy. John joins me from Washington. What do you mean doesn't care?
Well, I don't think he's really studied the issues. I mean, he essentially goes up there and has a big bark, but has a little bite in the substance of his comments. If he really cared about foreign policy and military issues, he certainly wouldn't have delivered a speech where in one sentence he says, NATO's going to have to pay for their own security, and the next sentence says, I'm going to make America great again, and we're going to be there for our allies. I mean, unfortunately, we're in a state of war in the world where NATO's under attack and our European allies are under attack. So if you truly care about something, you study up on it a little bit so you can at least sound coherent when you give a speech when you could potentially, be the nominee of the Republican Party for president.
What do you make, John, of this whole Trump phenomena?
It's interesting when you look at the foreign policy. When he looks backwards and you start to look at his statements, I mean, this is someone who stood up in South Carolina and trashed President Bush and Dick Cheney for invading Iraq and won a Republican primary in a very conservative state where Bush had done very well in 2000 and beat John McCain. He was able to do that, and it's really interesting. So I think when he looks backwards, he's able to critique neoconservative foreign policy in a way that Democrats have. I think what's concerning is going forward, and you start to look at that speech, he's got people around him now that have put sort of neoconservative tendencies back in. So he's somebody who took the problems of neoconservative foreign policy, where I think that the neocons had lost the base of the Republican Party and railed against it. But as we see him become the likely Republican nominee, he's begun to incorporate certain parts of their foreign policy going forward to win over the establishment.
But he did say that George W. Bush made a mistake. He said we can make mistakes, but that was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East. They lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There weren't any, and they knew there weren't any. What's your reaction to that? Do you think that George Bush knew there were no weapons of mass destruction?
Being someone who was in Iraq in 2003, I can tell you very quickly that we learned that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, mostly because, we received a lot of indirect fire. That was the, obvious delivery capabilities that Saddam had used against the Iranians in 1980 to 1988. But I do think the administration, as wrong as they were, felt that Saddam had chemical weapons. He had used them before. When we had trained prior to our invasion, through certain exercises, we had always prepared for chemical capabilities. So I think it was negligence on behalf of President Bush. I think they failed to look at their human intelligence sources properly, where Saddam obviously was presenting the fear that he had chemical weapons as a way to control the Shia majority and the Kurds. But overall, I think that Donald Trump raises some real concerns that many in this country feel now, Republican and Democrat, that the Bush administration led us into a debacle. Again, my concern with Donald Trump is that as you go forward now, he can criticize President Bush all he wants, but he has talked about sending large numbers of troops into combat in Syria. And to be fair, the Iraq war and the Syrian war are linked together, and the Syrian war is a byproduct of the Iraq invasion. So he may talk in this bold rhetoric anti-George Bush policy, but he is now starting to surround himself with people that support intervention in Syria. He said in a speech last week that we need to defend Christians. This is a very hardline right-wing comment to defend the Christian minorities in Syria, much like it was in our invasion of Iraq. So he's obviously appeasing the conservative right in this country, the religious right specifically.
New York Times Sunday magazine recently had a major article describing Hillary Clinton as a hawk, stating her foreign policy instincts are more aggressive than those of Obama and maybe more aggressive than those of Trump. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think this is going to be interesting, the way that this election plays out. I do think that Hillary Clinton on a debate stage with Donald Trump is vulnerable to Donald Trump attacking her the way he just attacked George W. Bush because she voted for the war. So I think that where she needs to draw the contrast is going forward. Hillary Clinton doesn't support torture. Hillary Clinton doesn't support doing things that are going to help Islamic terrorism, like banning Muslims from this country. Hillary Clinton doesn't support putting large amounts of U.S. forces into combat in Syria like Donald Trump does. So I think that he can try to play the Monday morning quarterback on her, but she needs to be very forceful in talking about where Donald Trump's going to take this country from a foreign policy standpoint. Anti-Islam rhetoric and banning Muslims from this country does nothing more than help ISIS and al-Qaeda globally recruit worldwide.
In late March, you tweeted that somehow I don't think the Democrats will be lucky enough for Donald Trump to be the nominee. Since it appears he's going to be the nominee, do you think he will be defeated easily?
I think that there's a lot of schools of thought, and I didn't think anybody read my tweet, so I appreciate that. I think, I think from the Vote Vets political action standpoint, and, we're going to spend a lot of money this cycle, millions of dollars. We're starting to hand out PAC money and hard checks to candidates that are really far down ballot. And when you start to look at some of these battleground states, you start to look at these Senate races for Norm Johnson against Russ Feingold in Wisconsin. You start to look at Mark Kirk versus Tammy Duckworth. The best arguments that Democrats have against Republicans in moderate districts is Donald Trump wants to send Mexicans back to Mexico, and Donald Trump wants to take Muslims and not allow them into this country. And so, yes, there's a debate raging between Democratic political operatives in this country about who's worse for the Republicans, Ted Cruz or Donald Trump. Obviously, as Lindsey Graham says, pick your poison. They're both terrible for Republicans down ballot. But I think that, Donald Trump offers some interesting dynamics one-on-one against Hillary in regards to bringing new people to the polls. But I think that he hurts Republicans down ballot in a devastatingly big way that could potentially lead to a wave of pickup seats for Democrats, not just in the Senate, but in the House.
What do you see as the most serious issue facing the next president?
Well, as a military person, I would love to see a presidential candidate answer a question that says, when would they engage U.S. troops in combat? I mean, it's an ideological question where someone should stand up in a debate and say, when would I engage U.S. forces into military conflict? Is that in the name of humanity? Is that in the name of protecting our country? Is that in the name of helping our allies? And I think that's a question that gets passed over. Obviously, I'm biased to it because of my personal background, but the president has tremendous amount of control based on the War Powers Act to engage U.S. forces in combat and military aspects, unlike they have on other things. The president's obvious, Obamacare policy was even taken all the way to the Supreme Court, yet military policy is something that I think every person who runs for president has to be able to answer these core questions of when they would engage our troops in combat. So from a very biased standpoint, obviously that's the issue that I care about most.
Obama recently announced that the United States is adding 250 military personnel, including special forces, to the 50 already on the ground in Syria. Do you support that?
I think it's dangerous. I think that Syria is a slippery slope. Obviously, looking at Iraq this weekend, I would like to see a president and a commander-in-chief, not play softball with the Iraqis that President Bush played, not play softball with the Iraqis like Lindsey Graham and John McCain's policies, where they continue to put U.S. blood on an Iraqi credit card until the Iraqi government can come together and the warring factions, the radical Shia elements, can come together and unite with the moderate Sunnis and show us that they have a real pattern and a real political agreement for success in Iraq. I think it's dangerous to add troops to either country. I think the problem in Syria is that, Iraq and Syria are linked. And I think that you have to be very specific and decisive about what the mission of those troops are. If it's something that's decisive and limited in nature and scope, then it has a chance to be successful. But again, if you really look back at these statements, but that started with something that Vote Vets opposed, which was arming Syrian rebels that had, links to radical jihadists. This administration has gradually slipped into a situation in Syria that is deeper than what they promised. With that said, the president, I think, in his heart of hearts, does not want to engage the U.S. military in a deep way there. But he has slipped us into a situation in Syria that is concerning.
Jon, you have served your country well, and you can continue to serve it well by speaking out. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Jon Soltz, chairman and co-founder of VoteVets.org.